Alright, welcome to your fourth Flip Classroom video. This is a remake because I just tried to make this and then I deleted it, somehow exporting it. So we'll hope this goes a little better. Remember, unplug everything. No texting, Facebook, Twitter, any of that during the video. Alright, we're talking about World War I and the Homefront. We have already talked about how World War I came to a close. We've talked about how the U.S. entry affected the war. Now we're talking about how it changed the U.S. at home. So you see, we're assessing political, economic, social, and cultural effects of the war on the U.S. and other nations. The first thing you need to understand is that the federal government took on a much larger role. When the entire U.S. economy had to refocus to fuel the Allied war machine, people thought that was too big of a task for private industry, and they didn't trust individual business leaders to do this the right way, so they gave a lot of power to President Wilson. I've got there that he got control to fix prices, make it so certain goods don't cost more than a certain level, because in a wartime shortage, Congress could have foreseen people trying to gouge prices, and he could regulate certain industries. But the big thing you need to remember, just like in the Civil War, just like in most of the wars we'll discuss, is the power of the federal government is greatly expanded. To help make sure that we were producing everything we needed, the War Industries Board was created, which was headed in 1918 by a guy named Bernard Baruch. They encouraged people to be more efficient in industry, and as a result of their efforts, the U.S. industrial production raises by about 20%. And then the government starts regulating some other agencies too. I've got there that the Railroads Administration monitored railroads and the Fuel Administration monitored the use of coal, gasoline, heating oil. You didn't want people wasting coal, gas, or heating oil, because if you do, obviously that's that much less that can go to support the Allied war machine. They started encouraging people to do little things like gasless Sundays, and I believe some places even had ordinances forbidding like driving without somewhere particular to go on Sunday. It used to be a thing. People just go for a drive in the country. They said, this is wasting gas. We need these for tanks and planes in Europe, this gas. They started encouraging people to switch off their lights, be smart and save electricity. You see that post on the right, it says switch off that light, less light equals more planes. That was, the way people looked at things. The more electricity you save, the more is available for these big plants to produce the war material. Then Ben Franklin had come up with the idea way back in the 1770s to have daylight savings time. So a way to take advantage of longer summer days, but nobody listened to him. Well, finally, the Fuel Administration institutes this in 1918. So you could say with this that Ben Franklin is almost 150 years ahead of his time in this aspect of his thinking. When the economy refocused for the war effort, wages went up, but unfortunately this didn't give a whole lot of help to people because the price of living rose at the same time. And you still had some of the same problems that had existed before the war. You got child labor, long hours, unions that were threatening to strike. Well, obviously, any strike from a union during the war is going to be terrible for the war effort. So the National War Labor Board is established by Wilson, and we mentioned the other day that if you worked in something like maybe a shipyard, you could get drafted exempt status. Well, if you had drafted exempt status, you went on strike, you would lose that drafted exempt status. So that's kind of an impetus to stay in and keep working and not strike. When you say, okay, you go on strike and you might get drafted. They also pushed for some of the things that labor unions wanted: shorter workday, safety inspections. Remember, this is not many years after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is about 7 years after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We talked about women jumping 8 stories to their deaths to get away from that inferno. And then the United States had a big responsibility when it came to providing food. We had to provide food for our own people, our army, but also a lot of the Allied peoples and the Allied armies, because most of the territory that Allied governments controlled was being torn up for war. You look at France, the French farmers' farms were being turned into trenches. So we had a big responsibility there, and the guy that is in charge of this is Herbert Hoover, who again gets a bad rep when he becomes president because the Great Depression started. But this time he was pretty well known for being the guy that kind of organized this effort. He set certain days: meatless days, sweetless days, porkless days, wheatless days, because again, the more Americans save, the more our allies and our troops can have the food they need. And in order to do this, they encourage families to plant what were called victory gardens. The thinking being, the more food that you can grow on your own, then the more food that farmers grow that we can ship to Europe. I've got the farmers' profits went up, and we'll see that that actually ended up biting us in the butt when the Great Depression rolled around, because we overfarmed in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then we basically used up the land, didn't allow it to replenish itself, and then this led indirectly to the Dust Bowl when that combined with the drought in the 1930s. And you see that poster there says, "Food is ammunition, don't waste it." You can look at that in several ways, but the more food our army has to fight, the longer they can fight. Obviously, you got to fuel the army's bellies too. When we talked about the propaganda posters the other day, some of those were things that would say at the bottom, Liberty Loan or Victory Bond. I told you this was the public borrowing system. It's basically you letting the government borrow money. It's like buying government savings bonds, but they're specifically to help the war effort, because now when the country is refocusing for the war effort, they had to spend money on tanks and planes. An army is not cheap. And the committee that was in charge of making sure that we had all of these posters to get people on board with the war effort was Committee on Public Information. And you see the poster there of Uncle Sam, and I showed you the other day how, can't really see in this one, how James Montgomery Flagg signed it right in there. But he was one of the more famous artists that worked for the Committee on Public Information, but it's headed by a guy named George Creel. And this is to influence Americans that this war is a good thing. Remember, there were a lot of Americans that still had ancestors that came from the Central Powers countries who we were fighting against, so you need to convince these people that the war is a good thing. And just like we've seen in recent years, there are some attacks on civil liberties of people that were associated with the countries that we were fighting. A lot of German and Austro-Hungarian immigrants were very heavily discriminated against. You can kind of link this to after September 11th, 2001. A lot of Arabic people were discriminated against, and not for any good reason, just for that they were of Middle Eastern descent or Arabic descent. Same kind of thing happened in World War I. And if you look at this, I've got orchestras refuse to play music by German composers. You know, that's a pretty big part of the repertoire if you think about guys like Beethoven being German. Schools stopped teaching German, which has always seemed ridiculous to me, because I would think if we're fighting the country, I would want to make sure that more of my people understood their language. Like I know today, if you speak like Arabic or you speak Chinese, it's going to help you if you're trying to get a job with the State Department. And somehow we short-sightedly in World War I got the notion that, well, we're going to fight Germany, so we're going to stop learning their language. And then I've got there some German foods were renamed. Like for instance, the hamburger is named after a town in Germany, so some restaurants changed their menu to call that the Liberty Sandwich. And I've got there, this is a lot like the U.S. discrimination against the French fries and things like that during the recent Iraq conflict. When we went into Iraq in 2003, the French were the most outspoken against us, saying that was not right. So some restaurants changed French fries to freedom fries on their menu. And they stopped serving French wines, things like that. Well, I want you to remember how during the Civil War, President Lincoln in the North and Jefferson Davis in the South both suspended the writ of habeas corpus to try to prevent any kind of dissent that they thought would be a drain on their war effort, where they could arrest people and lock them up without pressing any charges. Well, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were created during World War I to try to squash dissent. There's two laws that Congress passed that allowed for fines and imprisonment of up to 20 years for interfering with the war effort or saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government or the effort. And a lot of Americans felt, like you can see down here at the bottom of the slide, that this would take away their First Amendment rights. And then I've got that in the second bullet point. You can link it to the Alien and Sedition Acts from the 1790s. And remember, with those Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson and Madison responded with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, feeling again like their freedom of speech was being abridged. Now this eventually was tested in front of the Supreme Court. A guy named Charles Schenck, it's S-C-H-E-N-C-K, was arrested for distributing flyers to young men telling them to ignore the draft, because he said the draft violated the 13th Amendment because it created a condition of involuntary servitude, basically made people into slaves. And he was arrested for this. The Supreme Court upheld the government side of this, said that it was okay to suspend some civil liberties like this in a time of war. During the war, a lot of African Americans were faced with a tough choice. Do they support a government that's been very unsupportive of them, or they support the government and hope that things are better for them after the war? Well, W.B. Du Bois thought African Americans should support the war effort. He thought after the war this would strengthen the cause for racial justice, but like I said, others thought that These people are victims of racism, and they should not support a government that was victimizing them. So a lot of African Americans during the North, I mentioned yesterday, moved from the South. During the war, moved from the South to the North, and they did this for two reasons. They were hoping to escape discrimination in the South and get jobs in the industries in the North that were created as a result of the war. Things like plants producing munitions, tanks, planes, etc. And unfortunately, it wasn't a perfect world. And a lot of African Americans that moved to the North faced discrimination there as well. And there were actually race riots that broke out in Chicago and St. Louis. And I know Chicago and St. Louis are really Midwestern cities, but the big cities in the Midwest and the North were ones that really grew as a result of this great migration. I've got here that women supported the war effort. World War I presented the opportunity for a lot of women to get jobs outside the home that had been exclusively held by men before the war, but they were usually forced to give up their jobs when the men returned home from the war. They didn't get equal pay, but this did lead to a little bit more of a push for women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment. And we're going to wrap this little video up by talking about a 1918 flu epidemic. There was a strain of flu called the Spanish flu in 1918 that got killed as many as 30,000 people worldwide. It affected up to 25% of Americans and hurt the U.S. economy. And you can see in this top picture that you have nurses wearing flu masks, like you saw some people walking through airports with when people were worried about H1N1. And on the bottom picture, you've got a hospital ward full of flu patients. And I've seen a lot of different theories for why this spread. You know, it was called the Spanish flu, so a lot of people are thinking that, you know, World War I soldiers picked it up and carried it back to their respective countries after the war. I've also seen that may have spread in a lot of other ways to the United States, but this was one of the first eras where we can really say that America is becoming like starting to become a world superpower and becoming part of this big global interdependence that we have today. So diseases were harder to confine to specific areas of the globe. And this is really the first I can recall worldwide epidemic that we have since the bubonic plague, which still wasn't worldwide, maybe just kind of swept the Asian and European continents. Alright, remember you need to go on the wiki and fill out the Google form responding to this and any Google forms that you have not completed yet for late credit. Thanks.